HOA fined me $250,000 for violations on my land, didn't know I owned their entire neighborhood. The wind howled through the pines like a warning, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine resin through the valley where Marcus Holloway stood, arms crossed, staring at the freshly nailed notice flapping on the gate of his father's gravesite. It was a crisp October morning, the kind where frost still clung to the grass in the shadows, and the sun hadn't yet burned through the valley fog. The paper was official-looking, white with a red border, the kind of document designed to intimidate. In bold, blocky letters across the top, it read, "Final notice of violation and immediate fines." Below that, in smaller but no less menacing font, $250,000. Marcus read it once. Then again. Then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less absurd. He exhaled sharply, a puff of white in the cold air, and crumpled the paper in his fist. $250,000, he muttered, voice low. For burying my father on his own land? He looked past the gate, past the small, weathered wooden cross marking the grave beneath a towering Douglas fir, and across the rolling meadow that had been in his family for over a century. This was Holloway land. His great-grandfather had filed the homestead claim in 1898, back when the Oregon Territory was still being carved into counties and the nearest town was a logging outpost with a saloon and a telegraph. The Holloways had farmed it, logged it, lived on it, died on it. And now, after his father's passing, Marcus had done what any son would do, he'd buried him where he belonged. But the Oakridge Heights Homeowners Association didn't see it that way. They claimed the burial was a land use violation, that the grave was unpermitted, and that the act of interring human remains within 100 yards of any common area or residential structure breached their bylaws. They also cited aesthetic degradation, potential groundwater contamination, and disruption of community harmony. All of which sounded like legal speak for, "We don't like what you did." Marcus had known the HOA existed, of course. They'd been around since the late 1980s, when developers had carved up the eastern edge of the Holloway property, land his grandfather had sold off under a long-term lease agreement, to build a gated community of 117 homes. At the time, the family had thought it was a smart move. The lease was for 99 years, renewable, and the monthly payments were steady. The Holloways kept the core of the land, the meadow, the spring, the old homestead cabin, and the burial grove, and the developers got their subdivision. But somewhere along the way, the balance had shifted. The developers had folded, the management company changed hands 3 times, and the HOA board, now made up of residents who'd never met a Holloway, had grown bold. Arrogant, even. They began enforcing rules with the fervor of petty tyrants, fining people for lawn ornaments, paint colors, even the length of their grass. And now, they were coming after Marcus. He'd ignored their first notice, a $5,000 fine for unauthorized earth disturbance. Then a second, $25,000, with a threat of legal action. This third one, though, was different. It wasn't just a fine. It was a declaration of war. And they thought they could win. But Marcus Holloway wasn't just some grieving son with a shovel. He was a land use attorney. And he had a file cabinet full of deeds, maps, and water rights agreements that went back 125 years. He smiled, slow and cold, as he looked out over the valley. The sun finally broke through the clouds, glinting off the metal roof of the HOA clubhouse in the distance. He turned and walked back to his truck, the crumpled notice still in his hand. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Marcus drove the winding gravel road back to the old homestead, tires crunching over frostbitten gravel. The house sat at the edge of the meadow, a 2-story log structure with a wide porch and a stone chimney that had seen 100 winters. It had been built by his great-grandfather, Jacob Holloway, using timber felled from the surrounding forest. The windows were small, the floors uneven, but it was solid. Like the family. Inside, the air was still and cool. He tossed the HOA notice onto the kitchen table, next to a stack of yellow documents and a thick manila folder labeled Holloway Land Holdings, Original Deeds and Easements. He poured himself a cup of black coffee from the pot he'd left brewing that morning and sat down, flipping open the folder. This was where it all began. The first document was the original 1898 Homestead Act claim, signed by Jacob Holloway, filed with the Bureau of Land Management in Portland. It described the parcel, 320 acres, bounded by the North Fork of the Wildcat Creek to the west, the ridge line known as Eagle's Back to the north, the old logging road, now paved over, to the east, and the southern boundary marked by a split cedar post and a spring-fed pond. It was all there. The legal description. The surveyor's notes. The plat map. And then there was the 1921 water rights filing, another document Marcus had pulled from the county archives. His grandfather, Elias Holloway, had registered exclusive rights to the spring that fed the pond and the creek. That spring was the only reliable water source for miles. The HOA's entire water system, every tap, every toilet, every lawn sprinkler, ran off that same spring. Marcus sipped his coffee and flipped to the 1987 lease agreement. This was the one that had created Oakridge Heights. The developer, Cascade Ridge Communities, had leased 80 acres from the Holloways for 99 years at $2,500 per month, with an option to renew. In exchange, they got the right to build homes, but only on the eastern parcel, and only under strict conditions. One of those conditions was buried in Section 8, subsection D. All structures, roads, and common areas constructed on the leased parcel shall remain subject to the surface rights of the Holloway estate, and no permanent transfer of land title shall occur without written consent of the landowner. In other words, the HOA didn't own the land. They were tenants. And their lease? It wasn't even in the name of the HOA. It was in the name of Cascade Ridge Communities, LLC, a company that had been dissolved in 2003. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a slow realization spreading through him like warm water. The HOA had no legal standing. They weren't the owners. They weren't even the lessees. They were a self-governing association of homeowners who had inherited a broken contract and assumed it gave them authority over land they didn't own. And worse, they'd built on land they had no right to occupy. He pulled out the original plat map and laid it over the modern survey he'd commissioned last year. The overlay was startling. The HOA's common areas, the tennis courts, the pool, the clubhouse, were all built on what the 1898 deed clearly marked as Holloway property. The main road, Oakridge Lane, cut through a 30-foot wide easement that Jacob Holloway had reserved for family and agricultural use only. The HOA had paved it, installed streetlights, and treated it like a public thoroughfare. Even the sewer line, buried 6 feet below the surface, ran through a corridor that had been designated as a protected riparian buffer zone in the 1921 water rights filing. They hadn't just violated the rules. They'd built an entire neighborhood on stolen land. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. This wasn't just about his father's grave. This was about something much bigger. A century of quiet stewardship, of keeping to themselves, of letting the world forget who really owned what, had allowed this to happen. But now, they'd made their move. They'd find him. Attacked his family. Disrespected his father's final resting place. And in doing so, they'd handed him the perfect opportunity to take it all back. The next morning, Marcus drove into Portland, not to his office, but to the Multnomah County Recorder's office. He spent 6 hours there, pulling every document related to the Holloway land, the lease, the water rights, and the original subdivision plat. He photocopied everything, deeds, easements, surveyor's notes, even old tax records. He found a letter from 1991 in which the county had warned Cascade Ridge that their construction encroached on the reserved easement, but no action had been taken. He also visited the Oregon Water Resources Department and pulled the original 1921 filing, which confirmed that the Holloway family held senior rights to the spring. That meant Marcus could, if he chose, legally cut off their water supply at any time. By the time he left, his briefcase was heavy with evidence. That evening, he called in a favor from an old law school friend, Dana Reyes, who worked in land use litigation at a major firm in Salem. He sent her the documents, asked her to review them, and waited. 2 days later, she called back. "Marcus," she said, her voice tight with disbelief, "you're sitting on a goldmine. Or a time bomb. I'm not sure which." "What do you mean?" "I mean the HOA has no legal claim to that land. None. The lease was with a company that no longer exists. The current HOA wasn't assigned the lease. They just assumed control. And they've been building on land outside the leased area for decades. The clubhouse? That's on your property. The pool? Same. Even part of the main road is on your side of the boundary line. And the water? You own the spring. You have first rights. They're downstream users. You could shut them off tomorrow." Marcus exhaled slowly. "So they can't find me?" "No," Dana said. "They can't fine you for anything. In fact, you could fine them. For trespass. For unauthorized construction. For illegal use of water. You could sue them for damages, file for ejectment, or just take it all back." He smiled. "That's exactly what I was thinking." The next step was public records. Marcus filed a formal request with the county to update the land registry, reasserting the Holloway estate's ownership of the disputed parcels. He also filed a notice of intent to inspect all structures built on the property, citing his rights as the surface owner under the original lease. Then he did something else. He hired a drone operator. For 3 days, a small quadcopter circled the Oakridge Heights neighborhood, taking high-resolution photos and thermal imaging of every structure, road, and utility line. The images were stitched together into a detailed map that showed, in undeniable clarity, the extent of the encroachment. The HOA clubhouse. Built 42 feet onto Holloway land. The tennis courts. Entirely on the reserved easement. The main sewer line. Buried under a protected wetland zone. And the water main. Running directly from the spring, with no meter, no agreement, no payment. Marcus compiled the evidence into a single report, stamped with the seal of a licensed surveyor and notarized for legal weight. Then he waited. It didn't take long. 2 weeks after he filed the land registry update, the HOA board sent a letter. It was polite, almost deferential. They claimed they were reviewing the matter and seeking legal counsel to ensure compliance with all applicable laws. They also requested a meeting. Marcus agreed, but on his terms. He invited them to the Holloway homestead. The day of the meeting, Marcus stood on the porch, watching as 3 SUVs pulled up the gravel drive. The board members stepped out, 4 men and 2 women, all dressed in business casual, like they were attending a corporate retreat. They looked nervous. Marcus greeted them at the door, calm, composed, offering coffee. He led them inside to the living room, where a large table had been set up with binders, maps, and a projector. "Thank you for coming," he said, pouring coffee into mugs. "I know this is unexpected." One of the board members, a woman in her 50s with a tight bun and a name tag that read Linda Cho, President, cleared her throat. "Mr. Holloway, we wanted to discuss the situation. We believe there's been a misunderstanding." Marcus nodded. "I understand. That's why I asked you here. Let's clear it up." He turned on the projector. The first image was the 1898 homestead deed. "This," he said, "is the original land grant to my great-grandfather, Jacob Holloway. 320 acres. This includes the meadow, the spring, the burial grove, and the land where your clubhouse stands." He clicked to the next slide, the 1987 lease agreement. "This is the lease that allowed your development. It was for 80 acres. It expired when the company that signed it went bankrupt. No assignment was ever filed with the county. That means your association has no legal leasehold interest. Murmurs around the table. He clicked again. The drone map, this shows the actual boundaries. The clubhouse. 42 feet inside my property line. The tennis courts. On a reserved agricultural easement. The road. Paved over a protected corridor. And the water line. He paused. You've been drawing from my spring for 35 years without permission, payment, or metering. Linda Cho paled. We didn't know. No, Marcus said, voice calm. You didn't. But now you do. He leaned forward. You fined me $250,000 for burying my father on family land. You called it a violation. But under the law, you are the violators. You're trespassing. You're using my water. You've built structures on my land without consent. He let that hang in the air. Then he smiled. But I'm not here to sue you. Not today. Relief flickered across their faces. I'm here to offer a solution. He opened a binder and slid a document across the table. This is a new lease agreement. 5 years, renewable. It grants you the right to remain on the land, under my terms. Rent, $10,000 per month, paid to the Holloway estate. You'll install meters on the water lines. You'll remove any structures built outside the original lease area. And you'll recognize my authority as the surface owner. Silence. Finally, a man in a polo shirt, Greg Miller, VP of Operations, spoke. And if we don't agree? Marcus looked at him evenly. Then I file for ejectment. I shut off your water. I have the county declare your structures illegal. And in 6 months, this entire neighborhood is gone. He paused. Or you sign the lease. You pay your rent. And you live in peace. They left 2 hours later, the document unsigned but under serious consideration. Marcus didn't hear from them for a week. Then, on a rainy Thursday, a courier arrived at the homestead with a thick envelope. Inside was the signed lease agreement, a check for the first month's rent, and a formal apology letter. They also included a request: could the $250,000 fine be withdrawn? Marcus laughed. He didn't just withdraw it. He sent them a bill. For back rent. For water usage. For decades of unauthorized occupation. The total, $1.2 million. They paid $400,000 in a settlement. The rest was forgiven, on condition that they maintain the lease and respect the boundaries. But Marcus wasn't done. Over the next year, he began asserting his rights in full. He had the county resurvey the property lines. He installed discrete cameras along the boundary. He filed a formal notice with the state that he was reclaiming management of the spring and would begin charging for water usage. He also reopened the burial grove. His father's grave was joined by his mother's, then his grandfather's. He built a small stone wall around it, placed a bronze plaque with the Holloway family crest, and declared it a private memorial site. The HOA didn't complain. In fact, they started referring to him as Mr. Holloway in all official communications. They invited him to their meetings, as a guest of honor. They even asked if he'd consider running for the board. He declined. But he did suggest one rule change. Effective immediately, all residents were required to acknowledge the Holloway family's ownership of the land in their annual HOA agreement. A small clause, really. Just a line. But it was enough. Years passed. The neighborhood changed. Some homes were sold. New families moved in. The HOA board rotated. But the lease remained. The payments came like clockwork. The water meters were read monthly. And the boundary markers, small bronze plaques set into stone, were never moved. Marcus never became vindictive. He didn't raise the rent. He didn't evict anyone. He simply reminded them, quietly and firmly, who owned the land. And then, one spring morning, he did something unexpected. He hosted a community picnic. On the meadow. The same meadow where his father was buried. He set up tables, grills, games. He invited every household in Oakridge Heights. They came, hesitant at first, then laughing, eating, playing horseshoes. An elderly woman approached him, holding a plate of potato salad. "You know," she said, "my husband used to complain about the HOA fines. But now, I think I understand. This land, it's not just dirt. It's history." Marcus nodded. "It's memory. It's family. It's responsibility." She smiled. "Thank you for sharing it with us." He looked out over the valley, the sun shining on the trees, the creek glinting in the light. "We're all just temporary stewards," he said. "But some of us remember where we came from." The story spread, quietly at first. Then louder. A local newspaper ran a feature, "The Man Who Owned the Neighborhood." A documentary filmmaker came to interview him. Law schools began using the Holloway case as a textbook example of land rights, easements, and the dangers of assumed authority. Marcus didn't seek the attention. But he didn't shy from it either. Because the truth was simple. The HOA had fined him $250,000 for burying his father. But in doing so, they had awakened a sleeping giant. They had forgotten that land remembers. And Marcus Holloway, attorney, son, steward, had reminded them. He didn't just own their neighborhood. He was the neighborhood. And as long as the spring flowed and the pines stood tall, the Holloways would be there. Not as landlords. Not as conquerors. But as keepers of the land. And that, more than any deed or lease, was the real inheritance.